This is the Tory Leadership Election podcast, brought to you by Conservative Home. Welcome to Conservative Home's 7th Tory Leadership Election podcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation with Henry Hill, deputy editor of Conservative Home, and Andrew Gimson, associate editor of Conservative Home. So we're going to start, as we will from beginning to end, by looking ahead to next week to try to establish what lies ahead in the campaigning of this leadership election. So, Henry, what have we got?
So we're in the final straight now with regards to hustings. We have Manchester tonight, my old university stomping ground. And then next week we have Birmingham on Tuesday and Norwich on Thursday. And then after that, the only one left is the London hustings, which will be the following week. And I think, although I haven't seen any word of this, at some point we are due to have a restaging of the Talk TV Sun Showdown, which famously was called off halfway through because the presenter fainted. But there's no sign of that yet. So this week we've got Manchester, Birmingham and Norwich.
And let's just go over last week, because last week is your speciality. It was Scotland and it was Northern Ireland. I mean, have we learnt very much about A, who the Tories in those two parts of the UK will vote for, and then B, what the candidates' policies towards them are likely to be? Of course, is very important given the Northern Ireland Protocol in Northern Ireland and the independence or separation, as Liz Truss now prefers to call it,
yes,
issue in Scotland.
Absolutely, the separatists in Scotland. And this is a theme to which I suspect we will return, but in Scotland, a Liz Truss tendency has immanentized over the past few weeks, once it became clear that she was probably going to win the leadership. When I was first starting during the early stages of the contest, during the MP round, I sort of was doing a call around basically to try and see if I could find somebody maybe to do a collection piece where an MSP or an AM or whatever would endorse each of the candidates and explain why they were the unionist option. And one of the reasons that piece foundered is I simply couldn't find a Liz Truss person. Uh-huh. The Liz Truss campaign didn't get back to me about it. I couldn't find an MSP who would endorse Liz Truss. And yet now, lots of people seem to have concluded that she is in fact the great shining hope of the union. Good for her, I suppose. The Scottish, we'll do them both separately because I think they're slightly different. The Scottish hustings, I suppose they're probably better, in general, they're still better disposed to vote for Rishi Sunak, I think. The interesting thing for me is the way that actually in Scotland, on Scottish policy, there's not all that much clear blue water between the two candidates. Both of them are taking this kind of slightly post-Johnsonian, slightly muscular line. You know, if you think back a decade ago, there would probably have been pledges to give the Scottish Parliament and government, more powers, more money. Instead, both candidates, they vary a little bit in the detail, but the big theme from both of them is more scrutiny of the Scottish government. Now, in some cases, that means giving Holyrood more power to hold Scottish national ministers to account. In other areas, it involves giving Westminster more oversight authority. One thing I've been banging the drum for a long time is forcing or mandating the collection of uniform national statistics on things like public sector performance, because the Scottish Nationalists and Welsh Labour have changed the way they collect data to try and make comparisons more difficult. And so there's a really common thread there, which is, I think, more telling than if one candidate or the other were particularly strong, because it suggests there's been a general shift in the centre of gravity within the party on the constitutional question. Now, Northern Ireland, the most interesting thing about Northern Ireland is that it had got one at all. Got a hustings at all, because when the hustings rota was originally being drawn up, that was not the case. There was going to be a virtual hustings for Northern Ireland, and Andrew Stevenson, the party chairman, has said that it was after intervention and a plea by the chair of the Northern Irish Conservatives that they ended up doing a full hustings. Now, that is, I think, a win for the Northern Irish Conservatives. It meant that both candidates went out to Belfast, which I think is symbolically important. It meant that they got a chance to take questions from the Northern Irish Conservatives, whose normal role is to book the smallest room in the conference hotel and have a reception in it. And it was an opportunity to scrutinise the candidates on, as you say, the protocol. Now, I think it was actually a missed opportunity because the most interesting thing about the protocol legislation, or the most salient point, is that it doesn't actually solve anything. The protocol bill that is currently going through Parliament is an enabling piece of legislation. It gives ministers the power to fix the protocol, but it doesn't fix the protocol itself. Now, neither candidate has yet explained what they will do with the powers contained in the bill. I think this is a particular problem for Rishi Sunak, and you could sort of feel it in the room, in that he has been saying, I'm going to pass this bill, but it will take ages, so I'm going to negotiate with the European Union. And I think that there is a sort of reservation there in that, yes, it is plausible to think that you could pass the bill and then hold it in reserve and use it as leverage when negotiating with Brussels. But that only works if they think you'll use it. And nothing about Rishi Sunak's campaign so far suggests that he has a plan for using the protocol bill to fix the sea border if Brussels doesn't move. But it was nonetheless, it was a very interesting couple of meetings. And generally speaking, I think the union policies, they could always be better. They could always be bigger and more detailed. But I think compared to previous leadership contests, it's been a pretty good emphasis on the union question.
Do you feel we learnt anything really about how Liz Truss will handle the protocol, given that she's the candidate who's almost certain to win? Did we learn anything new? And then in relation to Scotland, is there any reason to think after she wins, as we must presume that she will, that the policy will actually be substantially different from the policy under Boris Johnson, very much affected by Michael Gove, who had oversight of it? Is there any reason to think that will change?
So on the Northern Ireland question, there is some more detail from Liz Truss. She has not presented a completely detailed proposal, but she has her red lanes, green lanes policy, which is basically a way of saying that if goods from mainland Britain are going to Northern Ireland and they are intended only for sale in Northern Ireland and not for shipping onwards to the Republic of Ireland and the rest of the EU, they will go through some green lane with no checks or the most minimal possible checks. Now, that is, I think, more than Rishi Sunak has committed to. It's not something the EU is happy about, although it's worth pointing out that the grace periods, the infamous grace periods, have now been operating for more than a year. And there's not yet any sign that the unrestricted inflow of British sausages into Northern Ireland is going to topple the single market. So I suspect that in practice, the EU might be prepared to end up living with this in the same way that it's ended up living with the grace periods. On Scottish policy, I mean, the thing about Boris Johnson's government is that it doesn't really have one. It has sort of three, and they're all subscribed to by different parts of the cabinet. And which one is implemented on any given week depends on, which courtier is in favour with the emperor that day. The reason I suspect there could be a shift in policy is because, as you say, what has generally happened is that Michael Gove has won most of the internal battles over union policy. He lost on Northern Ireland because he originally negotiated the time-limited grace periods. He lost on the UK Internal Market Act insofar as it was passed, but he has, according to people I've spoken to in cabinet, been quite effective in making sure that it's not been actually used very often. And yet, if you read the papers today, reports from Liz Truss's team saying that Michael Gove is going to be out, he's going to be off into Siberia. Perhaps the great empire of D-Luck will be broken up, who knows. But I think Michael Gove has really been the champion in cabinet for this conciliatory, non-confrontational style of unionism. Both the candidates, in fairness, have really been cutting across that with their announcements. But if Gove is really exiled, then I suspect what will happen is we will see a shift. How cogent and effective that shift is depends on who Truss hires to implement it. At one end of the scale, she just kind of gets rid of Gove and lets the territorial officers follow their instincts. At the other end of the scale, she reforms the union unit and rehires Oliver Lewis. And there's a range of options between. But I think there will be a shift in policy, yes.
Okay. I'm now going to turn to Andrew. Thank you, Henry. And I'm not going to do again what we did last week, which was basically we looked a long way ahead and said, if all the polls are right, the contest is over and Liz Truss has won. I'm not going to do that all over again, just because the very distinguished figure of John Curtis has come in and said effectively, Truss has won, 5% chance Sunak might win, he said. I'm not going to go over all that again because we've had another YouGov poll and another Colhome survey, which have confirmed what the YouGov poll and the Colhome survey said before. And then leave that aside, just assume for a moment that Liz Truss is going to win. I want to talk about the early days of her government. Because on the whole, her opponents, I don't mean her internal opponents, I mean the Labour Party, I mean the wider left, I mean the people who want the Tories out. I mean, this is a controversial term, but I will use it, the blob of elements in the civil service or the universities, or, what is sometimes called the deep state, the not so shallow state, who really don't like what the Tories have been doing since Brexit. They're all holding their fire. And as soon as Truss arrives in Downing Street, she's clearly going to meet the most fearful barrage, not just politically, but personally. So what I wanted to discuss with you is, what's the balance between getting the cabinet appointments right and getting the key staff appointments right? I mean, chief of staff, head of media, head of the policy unit. How important, in your view, is A, and how important is B?
I think we should resist the Superman or indeed Superwoman theory of some chief of staff who can make everything run smoothly. The whole point about politics is, and particularly our politics, is that things don't run smoothly. And if there should happen to be a calm couple of days, then the press will find some way on the third day of throwing a large rock into the still waters of. So there's always crisis, but the thing which tends to end prime ministerships is when their relations with the party break down. That obviously was the case with Boris Johnson, also with the party lost faith in Theresa May. And so I think I don't think, although of course, you want competent and capable advisors in number 10, I think actually the cabinet appointments and the relations with the wider party are very, very important. And from the beginning, there will be lots of disappointed people because you simply can't. I mean, J. Alfred Prufrock may miss out again on that post, which he's lusting after and has lusted after for many years. And there will be lots of J. Alfred Prufrocks and so from her own point of view, she mustn't think it's just a case of having a good team in number 10. It's very much binding in the parliamentary party is really vital.
Let's just deal with two different elements here. The first is the sheer number of disappointed people. Let's stick with that for a moment.
Yes.
By my calculation, Truss in forming a government is going to have to deal with the following elements and more. The first are all the people who were sacked as ministers before Boris Johnson became Prime Minister. The second is the ministers he himself sacked. The third is the ministers who resigned in July, who precipitated this contest. The fourth element is the interim government we have now, the ministers in it who Liz Truss will sack when she arrives.
Yes.
And then finally, she's got to make her appointments. So although we won't know till we get there, it seems to be quite likely that you'll have the highest number of former ministers ever on the backbenches. That will be difficult for her to handle, won't it?
It will. And of course they'll think they'll be making a better job of it than the new ones. But you have got to there is a lot of new talent around and you've got to bring that in. And she's indicated that she will bring new people like Kemi Badenoch in, or up. It will be very interesting to watch, and people will be waiting for her to make mistakes. On the other hand, having the hostility of the blob, I think, in the short term might do her some good, because the more unfair they are about her, the less. On the whole, I think most people do actually want to give a new prime minister a bit of a chance to show what they can do. So I'm not sure how unremitting the denunciations of her will be in the early weeks.
You have to balance the fact that if the parliamentary party has got any sense, they will want to give her a run. They'll also want to recognise that you're getting nearer an election and you can't keep deposing people without there being savage consequences. So you've got that on the one hand. On the other hand, you've got this frightening prospect ahead of strikes and mass inflation and, perhaps, who knows, people not paying their bills and all that. And what Conservative MPs are always preoccupied by, I can remember this having been one, is holding their seats.
Yes.
And so if they think they're not going to hold their seats, they get into a lather. That's why Boris Johnson has gone. After all, enough of them lost confidence in his ability to regain them their seats that he went. So I'm just trying again this thought that if they think that the administration is not in a place to sort of hold their seats, they'll get restive about how it works at the centre, because the centre's just got so much bigger than it was in Margaret Thatcher's time. If you read the blog of our contributor, John Redwood, John will write, I remember how we did it. We had person A, we had person B, we had person C. But since then...
There was an atmosphere of continual crisis during the 1980s. This idea that everything went smoothly under Margaret Thatcher. John Hoskins' memo in the early period saying that she was making a terrible hash of it. It was not,
I think, I'm not sure John was suggesting that wasn't the case.
Right.
The point I'm making is that government has just got so much bigger. And it's got bigger for a reason, which is that since, lots of reasons, but one of them is that since Thatcher's day, this great lobbyocracy has sharpened up its act, whether it's 38 Degrees or the big corporates or the charities or the NGOs. They become very, very skilled at lobbying MPs and basically suggesting to them, if you don't do what we do, we'll get rid of you. This makes it easier for them to panic and more inclined to blame the centre if it's not responding. And the centre's got bigger to deal with this lobbyocracy. So I'm just making my point again about getting the staff appointments right, because, of course, you don't want a chief of staff who thinks they're going to be able to control everything, but you do want a chief of staff who's going to know how to react when you realise you can't control everything.
And who can make decisions on behalf of, who knows what the Prime Minister would like. Because the Prime Minister, obviously it's a disaster if the Prime Minister is trying to take all the decisions in the a la Gordon Brown. That just is no way to run things. So you're right, you do need very good people immediately around you.
And you're off this evening to Manchester to sketch the hustings. So, I mean, by the time this podcast comes out, those two events will be more or less contemporaneous. What are you expecting to find?
Well, I think the wider public have got bored by this contest because it's gone on for far too long. And who cares, what Liz Truss said in sort of 1302 or something. It'd be interesting to see whether the people in Manchester are excited by it, whether for them it's still a great thing to be able to talk. Obviously, things were very animated in Perth. If you were there, it was an event. And so I shall discover whether it's an event, and also just what some Conservatives in the North West are saying about the candidates.
Argument that it's gone on too long, and I can obviously see the merits of arguing that. Isn't it in some ways a credit to the party, actually, that one of the reasons it's gone so long is they deliberately built into the calendar the opportunity to, for example, as Henry was saying, have a hustings in Northern Ireland. I mean, isn't it a wonderful thing in internal party terms that the party in Northern Ireland is quite small, but it is symbolically important, isn't it? A great thing that they're prepared to put this on and fly over Sunak and fly over Truss, so the members have got a chance to have a look at them.
I think that's a good thing, but on the other hand, rapidity is sometimes very important. It was obviously the overthrow of Lloyd George. I mean, these things build up for years and years and years, and people. Stanley Baldwin says that Lloyd George has a morally degrading effect on everyone who he encounters. And then there's the meeting at the Carlton Club in 1922, and Lloyd George is out. In 1940, again, sudden death. In 1963, the Tory conference in Blackpool, and a week of, several days of high drama, and then the astonishing emergence of the 14th Earl of Hume as the next Tory leader, unpredicted by anyone really. And then the Heseltine versus Major thing after the Götterdämmerung of Thatcher. There's something to be said in our tradition actually is to get these things over quickly, and so this is slightly against our idea of the sort of sudden death element in leadership contests. And
what do you? Let's just have a quick run through this again. What do you expect to happen to Boris Johnson, or for Boris Johnson to do, given that he's up against this inquiry, the terms of which are less favourable to him than the ordinary terms would be? In other words, the inquirer is being asked to find out whether he misled the House rather than deliberately misled the House. I mean, it looks pretty difficult for him, this, doesn't it? I mean,
my predictions about Boris Johnson are almost invariably wrong, actually, because I usually think, subconsciously, I think what would be the prudent thing to do, and often he doesn't do the prudent thing. But I think the right thing for him to do would be to stay in Parliament and give the House of Commons the benefit of his wisdom, and to see off the prigs who are trying to drag him down. If the prigs do drag him down, then that will rebound on the prigs. People will be very, very angry about that, I
think. Would it help at all in any way if the terms of the inquiry were revisited? I mean, I can't help thinking, honestly, the charge of a minister misleading the House of Commons led us, let me produce what in politics is known as a gaffe. In other words, what Daniel Hannan says is a statement of the obvious, which is that ministers mislead the Commons all the time.
Yes.
That is what they go into the House of Commons to do,
of course,
is to mislead the House of Commons.
Of course.
Hence, you do have this rule of, you mustn't deliberately mislead the Commons, which is there to really oil the wheels of the way the whole thing works.
And you can't have a debate with someone. If I say, Paul, you're a liar, I can no longer have a debate with you if I don't accept that what you're saying is said in some sort of good faith, which I do accept, by the way.
That's outrageous. So I can't be dealing with you like this.
All that reference to the honourable member is very important. And it does have to be upheld. But of course, there has also to be this recognition that, in fact, of course, ministers are constantly trying to pull the wool over the eyes of those who are scrutinising them. Yes, but I think the fact that ministers who are still in office are in a different category, in my opinion, to ministers who've been thrown out of office, and Boris has been thrown out. So it seems to me to be ridiculous to pursue him to impose the letter of the law on him now. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's understandable if he was still in office, but he's not.
The contrary view, rather than what could be described as this old boys club view, is that he's failed precisely because not only does he have no regard for the truth, but he doesn't even pretend to have a regard for the truth, and it's that's done him in.
Yes, he willfully exaggerates things, and he has absolutely no interest in literal fact. I think he does often speak truth about large matters. I've got rather a long and perhaps not entirely satisfactory passage in my forthcoming book about Boris Johnson about this. It's a very deep thing, but I think the people who start off by saying that he's a liar, they then cease to acknowledge that actually quite often he tells the truth, or has told the truth. Many of the things he promised to do, he did do. I mean, Brexit being the most obvious, but there were many other quite dull things which he did.
Well, we've both spent an enormous amount of time and energy in the past discussing Boris Johnson. No doubt we will do so again in the future. At this point, let me turn to Henry as we close. And go to our familiar items on who has been, if anyone, the winner and loser of the week. Henry.
Well, I will resist for another week the tendency to just declare that there have been no winners, because obviously I want to hold that in reserve. But I think, actually, touching on what we said earlier, the winners this week were probably the Northern Irish Conservatives. Because for a group that is basically the equivalent of a largish constituency party in any part of the country that isn't Surrey, and has perhaps 400 or 500 members, whereas Northern Irish Labour have 2,000 and they're officially not allowed to stand candidates. This was a really rare moment in the spotlight for them, they got to directly question two people, one of whom will be the next Prime Minister, which is a very rare privilege. And they got to bring those people to Northern Ireland, which is not somewhere that, mainland politicians of senior rank tend to go very often unless they're fixing some row between the DUP and Sinn Féin. So for all that their achievements are quite limited and their operational record is quite patchy, I think this really shows that, the Northern Irish Conservatives are an important part of the party. They clearly do have some heft. And maybe it will have, if not made members of the public in Northern Ireland think differently, it may have made the candidates think differently about Northern Ireland. Because my very firm view on Northern Ireland is that it's much easier to neglect if you haven't been. And once you've been, it's much harder to forget. And so I think one of the best things the Unionists in Northern Ireland could do is just encourage people to visit. In terms of losers, and again touching on something we said earlier, and indeed your very amusing TD this morning, I do think it's probably all of these people, and including some of these Scottish Conservatives, who have decided at the 11th hour that actually Liz Truss is the answer after all. Because, ultimately, if you're looking for preferment, the people she will choose, especially to give senior roles to, are going to be people who are A, ideologically sympathetic with her programme and or backed her early when it was a risk. Because those are the people that really count. They're the people that are in your corner. People who are declaring for you when John Curtis is saying there's a 95% chance that you've already won the election. Especially if they're changing sides, I think they're diminishing themselves, because say what you like about this contest, I don't think anything in this contest has really justified a major reassessment of the two candidates. I mean, I think Rishi Sunak, perhaps admittedly, with his flailing around on the Greenbelt, has perhaps undermined his claim to be a great truth teller, but I will be shocked if there is a single Conservative MP who stands up and says, well, I was all for Rishi Sunak until he promised to gold plate the Greenbelt. But generally speaking, Liz Truss's economic programme is what it is. You either believe in it or you don't. Rishi Sunak's economic assessment hasn't changed fundamentally. You either agree with him or you don't. And I think it's difficult to see how a fair-minded observer could, with any sort of sense of Olympian detachment, have watched this contest and decided that actually they think that £50 billion of unfunded tax cuts is a good idea after all, or however much it is. So I'm going to go with them, because they won't get preferment. They will have tarnished their reputations, and they're going to end up unhappy on the back benches without even their convictions for company.
I want to make the point in closing, because it's my role to shamelessly puff whatever Conservative home does under almost any circumstances, is that we've turned out to be enormously helpful to the Liz Truss campaign, because other outlets, as we did, during the parliamentary stage, produced a list of who MPs were voting for. I think I'm right in saying we then became the first, followed very quickly by Guido, the first item to start recording who they were voting for after the parliamentary ballot had taken place. Consequently, there's been a sort of big push by the Truss campaign to ensure that she ends up with more MPs signed up to her than to Rishi Sunak. So you can take the people who've signed up seriously, or you cannot. But at least, Truss will have either the fig leaf or the armoured shield, whichever you think it is, to be able to get up in the Commons and be able to say, no, more colleagues supported me than supported my opponent, and she will be able to give the figure. All this because we and Guido started counting them after the parliamentary stage had finished.
Well, how fortunate for her that we were sufficiently public-spirited to think to do that. But again, it's going to be the case that yes, and I think you raised a really interesting point earlier in the contest, which is the way that the MP round is currently set up is problematic in as much as there isn't a final round between the final two. Mm-hmm. So neither candidate necessarily emerges with 50% of the vote amongst the MPs, which is potentially problematic. And so if Liz Truss can emerge from this contest saying, look, there are many forking paths on the road to Damascus, and many of my colleagues found their way here, and at the end of the contest, I have got more than 50%, that will probably contribute to some degree to the stability of the government, which is important, and therefore it is a good thing, even if I am perhaps corrosively cynical about the motivations of many of the people involved.
There you are. You always knew Conservative Home was there to be helpful to the Conservative government after all, with which I'll end this podcast. I'm looking forward, Henry, to being back here with you, and I think William Atkinson next week. It's goodbye from us. It's thanks to Andrew, and we'll see you all again this time, same place next week.